Hello to my fellow history lovers and people that think if I learned something today, it will be a good day. So, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between being the head of the army. This is General Burgoyne, head of the British Army, who surrenders and has it not so bad. We've been talking about that the last few days. He basically is paroled. He lives in Boston for a little less than a year, and then he has a gentleman's agreement that he won't fight the Americans anymore and is allowed to go back home to Britain, where he basically lives out his days in part as a playwright. The men he left behind, on the other hand, had a much more, well, frankly, horrifying life than did their general when he left. So we mentioned that after the battle ended, the top guns, which were the top officers and General Burgoyne himself, were actually invited to dine with Horatio Gage, who was the top American officer, and his officers. They all went to a tent and had wine and talked because there's this idea of gentleman's agreement that, yes, while we're enemies on the field, we're all gentlemen after the cannon smoke clears. The same will not be true for Burgoyne's men. So again, he and his officers have a pretty good situation. They're paroled and they can basically rent where they want to and live out their lives. This is what happened to his men. So after the Battle of Saratoga, where Burgoyne surrenders thousands of men, about 6,000 men, and was a huge victory for the Americans. Because of this, the French will come in on our side and they'll give us much needed supplies and a navy, etc. But let's talk about what happens to these guys. The common foot soldier is actually marched under what was called the convention. They were called the Convention Army, and that was the Convention of Saratoga, because there was an agreement on this point of the surrender that these men would be marched to Boston and allowed, like Burgoyne, to go home on ships. So not so bad. But the Congress reneged on this agreement, and in part because they believed that the British wouldn't hold up their end. The deal was if these guys are allowed to go back to Britain, then they just promise not to fight, it's done. And those were actually the terms that British General Burgoyne surrendered under. However, the Congress thought, we don't think Britain is going to stay true to this. We think they're going to ship them back, they're going to rearm them, and then just ship them back. So Congress said, no way are we going to do this. Instead, these thousands of men were initially, when they still, I think, believed they were going to go back home, were marched around Boston area. I think it was Cambridge. Long march, arduous march. It was like 250 miles from where they surrendered to Boston, and often didn't have enough food. Clothing is hard to come by, and they're kept outside of Boston. Well, at the time, Boston is already overcrowded. Food is an issue, and trying to support another couple thousands of soldiers wasn't working. So they were kept there for 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, Congress thought, this isn't working. We'll ship them down to Virginia. And the idea was, well, Virginia is it'll be inland and it'll be away from the ocean, so they can't like hop on ships and get back. And the idea was sort of rural agricultural area. It will be easier to support them. Well, they are marched 700 miles. Again, grueling march. A lot of them die along the way, get sick. And also, I should add, a lot of them are deserting wherever they can get a chance. But they are marched down to Virginia, and they're kept in a sort of makeshift barracks. You could think of it like an outdoor prison. It's not a true prison. We didn't have enough prisons to hold thousands and thousands of British soldiers, but they're kept sort of in these outdoor huts. Again, terrible food situation, just absolute terrible situation. And what happens is the people in Virginia, they're not happy either. They're like, these guys are draining a lot of our resources. Food is getting short again. So 2 years later, so mind you, the surrender was in 1777. They're kept outside of Boston till 79. Now, then they're marched 700 miles down to Virginia, and again, Congress says, well, that whole Virginia thing didn't really work out. We agree. And Virginia didn't want them. So now they are marched again all the way back up to Pennsylvania. And this is 1781. And a lot of them will actually then have been prisoners. 1783 is when the war ends, when they will finally be released. A lot of them deserted in the meantime and just sort of went into communities whenever they could blend in. And also, to some extent, a lot of them at the end of the war, when they were released, chose to stay in the United States rather than go back to Britain. Anyway, thank you for letting me share, and I will see you tomorrow. And if you're thinking this whole Battle of Saratoga sounds honestly really interesting, I'd like to time travel there, but not get shot at. Well, you can read Cap Westgard and the Second Battle of Saratoga, which is freely downloadable till the end of August, and the link is in the description below.